Before you die, what do you want people to know about the death penalty?
I want people to know that the people on death row are not the monsters that the public or the justice system portrays. As our executive director, Esther Brown, always says, you have to know the story behind the story.
Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're going inside the final moments of a man Alabama just executed after nearly 30 years on death row, Anthony Todd Boyd. Before we begin, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below. That's how we keep growing this community and telling the stories that matter, stories that make us question justice, forgiveness, and truth itself. October 23, 2025. Holman Correctional Facility, Atmore, Alabama. The time was a few minutes past 6 when guards escorted Anthony Boyd into the small white chamber. He'd spent half his life in a cell waiting for this moment. For years, his name had been caught between guilt and doubt. But tonight, the state decided it was over. Hours earlier, Boyd had eaten his last meal, a simple request: 2 cheeseburgers, fries, a Coke, and a slice of chocolate cake. He ate quietly, spoke little, and asked the officers to thank the kitchen staff. When they cleared the tray, he told one guard, "Don't let them tell you I did what I didn't." It was calm, matter-of-fact, the way a man talks when there's nothing left to fight but the clock. He was calm. The room was silent, except for the sound of handcuffs being removed and the rustle of paper from the witnesses' seats. He was strapped into a gray metal chair and fitted with a black breathing mask. This was Alabama's new way of killing: nitrogen hypoxia. No needles, no chemicals, just a gas meant to replace oxygen until the brain shuts down. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Boyd didn't hesitate. He said, "I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in killing anybody. There can be no justice until this system changes. Let's get it." Those words hung in the air like something heavier than the oxygen they were about to take from him. At 6:21 p.m., the gas began to flow. His chest rose fast, then slowed. Within a minute, his body went still. 11 minutes later, he was declared dead. On the other side of the glass, reporters typed silently while one of them whispered, "The execution was painful." According to more witnesses, the execution was not swift. He struggled to breathe, shook his body for minutes before he was pronounced dead. That night, Alabama called the execution smooth. But outside the gates, protesters stood in the dark holding candles and signs. Some said Boyd died for a crime he didn't commit. Others said justice had finally been done. Why'd? But here's the question that keeps echoing. How did a man with no criminal record, no physical evidence against him, and nothing but shaky witness statements end up dying like this? To understand that, we have to go back to Gadsden, Alabama. A small town where rumors traveled faster than truth, and one bad night turned into a death sentence. This is the men from Gadsden, the execution of Anthony Todd Boyd. Stay with us, because what happened before that gas mask ever touched his face tells a story far more complicated than what the headlines say. Welcome back, and if you're just joining us, please take a second to subscribe and leave a comment below. Every time you do, you help this community grow, a space where we look deeper than the headlines, and where every story finds its truth. Now, let's go back to where Anthony Todd Boyd's life began. Gadsden, Alabama, a small town sitting along the Coosa River, quiet most days, but never far from struggle. In the early 90s, like many southern towns, Gadsden was changing. Factories were closing, jobs were disappearing, and drugs had started filling the cracks that poverty left behind. Anthony wasn't born into privilege. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where everybody knew your name, and trouble was more about bad luck than bad character. People who knew him back then said he wasn't violent or dangerous, just another young man trying to make it, sometimes taking the wrong steps to survive. He was known for his quiet nature. Didn't talk much, but when he did, he meant what he said. Friends called him Todd. He liked basketball, cars, and Sunday dinners at his aunt's house. No one ever thought his name would one day be tied to a double murder. But the Gadsden of 1993 wasn't kind to young black men with few opportunities. The city's drug trade was small but growing fast. Dealers, addicts, and hustlers all knew each other. Everyone owed someone something: money, loyalty, or silence. The police were under pressure to clean the streets. Newspapers ran stories about rising crime, about drugs turning neighborhoods into war zones. And when 2 men were found shot to death in a vacant lot that spring, the community wanted answers. Fast. It didn't take long before rumors started. People whispered names, trying to protect themselves. A few said they saw Anthony that night. Others claimed they heard he'd been looking for someone who owed him money. $200? The kind of small debt that can suddenly mean everything when pride, fear, and survival mix together. At first, Anthony wasn't even a suspect. He wasn't hiding. He was working odd jobs and staying with family, but when the police rounded up known users and dealers, his name came up again, mentioned by men trying to save their own skins. That's how it usually begins in cases like this. Not with evidence, but with stories. One person trying to bargain with freedom says something, another repeats it, and soon it becomes fact. Within days, Anthony Todd Boyd was called in for questioning. What started as an interview quickly turned into an accusation. The detectives said he was angry, that he wanted his money, that the night had ended with 2 men shot dead over a drug deal gone bad. Anthony denied it all. He told them he wasn't there. That he didn't even know the victims like that. But once a name enters a murder case in a small town, it's almost impossible to take it back. His mother said he looked lost the day they arrested him, like he couldn't believe this was happening. "They're saying I killed 2 people, he told her, shaking his head. "Mama, I swear I didn't do it." From that moment, his life was no longer his own. Reporters started printing his face under bold headlines. People who once nodded at him on the street stopped making eye contact. And in a town already divided by fear and race, it was easy for the story to harden into something unshakable. Another young man gone bad. But those who really knew Anthony, his family, his pastor, a few friends who still spoke up, said something didn't add up. The boy they knew wasn't a killer. He didn't have the heart for it. Still, in 1993, Alabama, the truth didn't matter as much as closure. The police had their man. The community had its story. And before long, the case of the men from Gadsden was sealed in the public's mind. What no one realized then was that the next 30 years of Anthony Boyd's life would be spent fighting that version of the truth, the one that started in a rumor and ended with a mask full of nitrogen. By the time investigators pieced together their version of events, everything came down to a number that barely made sense: $200. That was what the prosecution said started it all. Not revenge, not hatred, just a small debt in a world where small things could turn deadly. According to the state, Anthony Boyd went looking for that money on a warm night in 1993. They said he and a few others drove around Gadsden, stopping at houses and street corners, asking questions about 2 men who supposedly owed him. But nobody ever proved that conversation took place. No recordings. No eyewitness who could describe what he wore, where he went, or how he got there. Just talk. The kind that shifts shape every time it's retold. The story the state built rested on 3 witnesses. Each had something to lose, or something to gain. One was already facing charges for drug possession. Another was trying to avoid a longer sentence. The third had been drinking and using that night, his memory blurring between fact and fear. Together, their words painted Boyd as the man who pulled the trigger, but the details never lined up. One claimed the argument happened in a car, another said it was behind an abandoned house. A third swore it took place in an alley miles away. They couldn't even agree on who fired the shots first. What they did agree on, conveniently, was that Anthony Boyd was there. The police leaned hard on those testimonies. They needed a suspect who could bring closure. And Boyd, quiet and unconnected, was an easy name to hold on to. When he was questioned, he didn't shout or fight. He kept saying the same thing. "I wasn't there." But calm doesn't play well in an interrogation room. They took it as coldness. What prosecutors never explained was why a man with no criminal record would suddenly risk everything over a small-time debt. There was no proof that any money had changed hands, no drugs found on the scene, no weapon linking Boyd to the murders. What they had was a narrative that fit the fear of the moment, the idea that violence over drugs was out of control and the system needed to show strength. One detective later admitted off the record that the case was paper-thin. But by the time it reached trial, the momentum was too strong to stop. The victims' families wanted justice, and the district attorney promised to deliver it. Anthony's mother sat through every hearing, clutching a Bible in her lap. She told reporters she believed the truth would come out, that her son would walk free. But the courtroom wasn't built for doubt. It was built for decisions. And in Etowah County, decisions often came fast when it came to drugs, race, and fear. The $200 debt became more than money. It became a symbol, a reason to convict, a way to say order had been restored. By the end of that summer, the police closed the file. The papers ran headlines calling it the drug debt murders. And just like that, Anthony Todd Boyd became the face of a story that had already been decided long before his trial began. What no one talked about then were the men who testified against him, how their own sentences quietly disappeared over the years, how one of them later admitted in a letter that parts of his testimony were not exactly true. But by the time that surfaced, the damage was done. The system had its closure. And Anthony had a cell waiting for him. The courtroom in Etowah County was packed the day the trial began. Reporters filled the first 2 rows, cameras waiting outside, and a jury that already looked tired before the first witness spoke. Everyone seemed to know how this story was supposed to end. The state had said it enough times. But behind the smooth words and confident tone, the case was cracked. From the start, defense attorneys argued that the men who pointed fingers at Anthony Boyd had been forced into it. Not persuaded. Forced. They were facing their own charges, and investigators had made it clear: cooperate or face the same fate. One of those men, during cross-examination, stumbled over his own testimony. He admitted detectives had visited him more than 10 times before he gave a consistent statement. Another had originally told police he didn't see the shooting, until prosecutors offered to drop a separate robbery charge. Those deals were never made public during the trial, but defense lawyers hinted at them every chance they got. Then came the third witness, a man who had been drunk the night of the murders and couldn't keep his story straight. At one point, he even mixed up the victims' names. Still, his testimony stayed in the record, unchallenged, because it fit the prosecution's picture. Anthony Boyd as the gunman, standing over 2 bodies, collecting a $200 debt paid in blood. The defense tried to show the jury how impossible the story was. The timeline didn't make sense. The witnesses contradicted each other. The police never tested for fingerprints or matched any bullets to Boyd. But the judge allowed every statement to stand. When the defense objected, the prosecution leaned on the same line. These men were there. What the jury never heard were the threats. One co-defendant later told a reporter that investigators warned him, "Say you saw Boyd," or "We'll say you pulled the trigger." Another said his plea deal was written before he even testified. But by then, the verdict was old news. The state's attorney used emotion, not evidence. In closing arguments, he turned to the jury and said, "If you let him walk, you're telling every drug dealer in Gadsden that life is cheap." It wasn't about Anthony anymore. It was about sending a message. The defense's final statement was quiet. Too quiet for a jury already ready to decide. "You've heard stories," the lawyer said, "but not one piece of proof." When he sat down, the courtroom stayed silent. The jury was gone less than 2 hours. Guilty. There was no gasp, no cry, just the sound of paper shuffling as the clerk read the words that sealed his fate. When the judge pronounced the death sentence, Anthony didn't speak. He just turned toward the gallery, his eyes meeting the empty seat where his mother had sat every day until she couldn't bear to anymore. Outside, the district attorney told reporters justice had been served. "This community can sleep again," he said. But even then, cracks were showing. A juror later confessed she wasn't sure they'd done the right thing, that the evidence felt thin. Another said she believed the men who testified were scared of something bigger. Years later, letters surfaced, unsigned, mailed from prison, claiming the whole case was built on threats, pressure, and promises. One letter ended with a line that still haunts those who read it. "We all knew he didn't pull that trigger, but somebody had to pay." And pay he did. The verdict sent Anthony Todd Boyd straight to Holman's death row, not for what was proven, but for what was convenient. The years after the verdict moved slow, painfully slow. Anthony Todd Boyd entered Holman Correctional Facility in the summer of 1995, stepping into a place built to erase time. Every cell on death row looked the same. 6 feet wide, 10 feet long, steel bars on one side and a small window that showed nothing but light you couldn't touch. Inside, life was a routine that never changed. Wake up at 3 a.m. when the lights flickered on. Breakfast slid through a slot. Cold eggs, stale bread. Then silence. Hours of it. Men would whisper through the vents, tapping messages in code on the pipes just to remind each other they were still alive. Boyd didn't talk much those first few years. He spent most of his time writing. Letters to lawyers, his mother, anyone who'd listen. Some never made it out. Others came back stamped return to sender. He wrote about the trial, about how the witnesses lied, about the men who cut deals to save themselves. But most of all, he wrote about faith. Not in the system, but in something bigger, something that couldn't be bribed or threatened. The guards said he was quiet, respectful, never caused trouble. One described him as the kind that didn't belong there. But belonging didn't matter. Once you were on death row, the state didn't see you as a man anymore, just a date waiting to be set. He watched men come and go, some walking to the chamber claiming innocence, others accepting guilt. Every few months, the sound of chains in the hall meant another execution was coming. The rest of the row would go still, listening to the echo of footsteps fade away. Then the next morning, breakfast would arrive again like nothing had happened. Anthony's appeals went on for decades. His lawyers argued that witnesses had been coerced, that the evidence was unreliable, that the trial was flawed from the start. Some courts agreed, saying the case raised serious concerns. But every time it seemed hope might break through, another ruling came back stamped denied. By his 50th birthday, Boyd had spent more of his life behind bars than outside. His hair had gone gray, his body thinner, but his words sharper. In interviews, he spoke softly, choosing each sentence carefully. "They can take my time, but not my truth." Holman was falling apart by then. Mold in the showers, cracked floors, and a smell of bleach that never left. The men called it the end of the road. But for Boyd, the end wasn't fear. It was waiting. Waiting for the state to remember him again. In his final appeal, his lawyers begged for a new trial. They presented affidavits from 2 witnesses recanting parts of their testimony. The court acknowledged them, then dismissed them as insufficient. It didn't matter that one man admitted he'd lied. The system rarely looks back. Through it all, Boyd kept writing. In his last letter, sent months before the execution, he ended with a single line that showed both peace and defiance. "I'm not afraid to die, but I wish I'd been truly heard before it came to this." For nearly 30 years, he lived each day measured by the sound of doors closing. And when his day finally came, there were no surprises left. Just a man the world forgot until the state decided to remember him again. By the fall of 2025, Alabama was under fire for bringing back executions in a new way, not by injection, but by suffocation. The state called it nitrogen hypoxia, a humane alternative after years of botched procedures. But critics said it was just a cleaner word for the same old thing. Death. Anthony Todd Boyd became the second person in U.S. history to face it. For years, his lawyers warned that the state was experimenting with human lives. They filed motion after motion, arguing that no one could know what would really happen once the gas started, but the courts denied every one. Procedurally proper, the judge said. That was the phrase that decided his fate. October 23, 2025. The curtain inside Holman Correctional Facility rose just after 6. Behind the glass, Anthony Todd Boyd lay on the gurney, eyes open, breathing slow. The mask covered half his face, sealed tight against his skin. This was Alabama's latest test, nitrogen hypoxia, the so-called humane method. What followed would challenge that claim forever. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then Boyd's body tensed. His fingers curled into the straps. The gas was invisible, odorless, but everyone in that room saw its effect. His chest began to heave, slow at first, then faster, sharper. His head jerked against the pillow, his lips moved as if trying to form words. Witnesses later said he appeared to tremble and stutter, taking deep, gasping breaths that turned into long, shuddering draws for air. His eyes rolled upward, showing only the whites. Lee Hedgepeth, one of the media witnesses, wrote afterward, Boyd's body jolted. He thrashed against the restraints. His eyes rolled back, leaving only their whites. Each breath rattled through the mask, his chest heaving in visible struggle. For 15 long minutes, those breaths didn't stop. It looked like he was gasping for air, one witness whispered after the curtain fell. 38 minutes passed before a doctor pronounced him dead, the longest nitrogen hypoxia execution to date. Even the commissioner for the Alabama Department of Corrections later admitted it took longer than expected, though he insisted the process was according to protocol. But Boyd's execution wasn't the first to show this. In January 2024, Kenneth Smith had been the first man to die this way, writhing in pain, thrashing against his straps for over half an hour. In September, Alan Miller shook violently and gasped for breath for 16 minutes before going still. A month later, Kerry Grayson lifted his legs off the gurney, struggling until he too was pronounced dead after 16 minutes. By early 2025, Demetrius Frazier and Gregory Hunt suffered the same fate. Apparent consciousness for minutes, not seconds, witnesses said, with violent convulsing, eyes bulging, and clear gasping for the air that would not come. Then, just a month before Boyd, Jeffrey West coughed and gasped deeply, appeared to foam at the mouth, and turned purple before finally falling still. Justice Sonia Sotomayor had warned the nation that nitrogen suffocation was not what it was promised to be. Her words echoed again now, as Boyd's body trembled for the better part of 40 minutes. Shuddering, open-mouthed, chest-heaving gasps, she had written months before, a phrase that now described exactly what witnesses saw inside Holman's death chamber. Boyd's last words came quietly before the gas began. "I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in killing anybody. There can be no justice until the system changes." When the warden signaled for the gas to start, Boyd looked toward the observation room one last time. His chest rose, then locked in place. As the minutes dragged, his body jerked again and again, a faint thump against the restraints with every breath. By the time the doctor entered, his head had fallen to one side, mouth slightly open, mask fogged with condensation. Outside the prison, the air was still. A small group stood by the gate, candles flickering in the night wind. When the news broke that it took 38 minutes for Boyd to die, someone whispered, "They said it was humane." No one spoke after that. What happened that night didn't just end a life. It raised a question. How many more must gasp, struggle, and choke before the state admits what the witnesses already know? This isn't mercy. It's a slow kind of drowning, behind glass, with the world told not to look away. In Gadsden, where the case began 30 years earlier, the reaction was mixed. Some still believed he was guilty, that the courts wouldn't execute an innocent man. Others had doubts that never faded. One of the original jurors, now in his 70s, told a reporter, "We were told the other men testified freely, but I don't know if that was ever true." The so-called accomplices, the men who once claimed Boyd helped in the murders, were long out of prison. 2 of them had recanted years ago, saying they were pressured by investigators and promised lighter sentences. The courts dismissed their statements as too late to matter. But for many watching now, those words carried a weight the system refused to hear. Outside Alabama, Boyd's death sparked protests. College campuses lit up with debates about the morality of nitrogen executions. Activists pointed out that the state was testing a method no medical board approved, and no scientist had studied on humans. The American Bar Association called for an immediate halt, but Alabama's governor stood firm, saying, "Justice must not be delayed any longer." Boyd's body was returned to Gadsden 2 days later. His family held a quiet service in a small church he'd attended as a boy. No cameras, no speeches, just a few hymns and a folded photo of him smiling from before the trial. A preacher closed the service by saying, "May truth find its way, even if the man can't." Weeks later, the debate raged on. Lawmakers argued whether nitrogen hypoxia violated the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. One senator said it best on live TV. Alabama didn't just kill a man, they reopened a question this country has been avoiding for decades. What do we really call justice? Anthony Todd Boyd's name faded from the news soon after, but in quiet corners, on podcasts, true crime forums, and among death penalty lawyers, his story still echoed. People kept circling back to the same unanswered question. What if he was telling the truth all along? In the end, the echo of his words, calm, defiant, final, still lingers. There can be no justice until this system changes. And somewhere between Gadsden and Atmore, that echo still rides the wind, a reminder that some truths don't die, even when the man who spoke them does.